Today's discussants are Rob Storr, the moderator, Lisa Yuskavage, Roberto Clemente, and Karen Helenshoy. Karen is here as a special guest. She came in at the last minute, and she will just add some comments as necessary. And I think I said Roberto Clemente. Forgive me, it's Francesco Clemente. Sorry. It's Yuskavage, I'm sorry. Okay, now I've made all my mistakes. I'm sorry.
I wish.
The exhibition upstairs is the result of great collaboration by a number of parties, most specifically the generous lenders and supporters. And I particularly want to identify the Royal Norwegian Consulate General, Sissel Bray, Consul General, who is represented here today by Ingrid Moe. It's their generosity which has made possible this program and all our public programs. We're very pleased to have Rob Storr here as a moderator. Rob is an ASF advisory trustee and was curator of North by New York, one of our centennial exhibitions, which was presented 2 years ago. Rob is one of America's most distinguished curators and critics. He was the curator of contemporary art at MoMA from 1990 to 2002. He was then a distinguished professor at NYU Institute of Fine Arts. He was the director of the Venice Biennale in 2007, the only American to hold that position. And since 2006, he has been dean of the Yale School of Arts. We're also pleased to welcome, as I mentioned before, Karen Helenshoy, who is the director emerita of the Henny Onstad Art Center out in Oslo. She served earlier as curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Oslo, and before that as curator of contemporary art at the Henny Onstad. She is the organizer of countless exhibitions that have been shown in Oslo, throughout Scandinavia, and throughout Europe. She was the curator of a wonderful exhibition presented here at Scandinavia House in 2005 entitled Norge, a wonderful view of contemporary Norwegian art. And she has been an invaluable advisor to the ASF for many years. So it's great to have her with us, but it's great to have all our panelists here, and I'll now turn it over to Rob.
The premise of this show, which I have only a vague idea of, but some idea, has to do with a posthumous collaboration, if you will, between Andy Warhol and Edvard Munch, and with an exhibition of works made upstairs for a never fully realized project late in Warhol's life, one of many in which he worked off of art by other masters, old masters. He worked off of the Birth of Venus, he worked off of De Chirico, he worked off of a number of Giovanni Paolo, I believe. He worked off of a number of artists and made prints or other incarnations of those images, which is part and parcel of what Warhol did in many ways, but to dip into the old masters, to dip into a certain number of canonical works, was unforeseen from the point of view of a lot of people who thought of him as actually entirely located in the contemporary, the glamorous, the Hollywood, and so on and so forth. And then raises all the questions about, well, what happens with somebody of that sensibility goes in this other direction. One of the simplest versions, sorry, I'm losing my mic here. If I were a lounge singer, I would never make that mistake. But in some ways, I used to say when I was at the Institute, I gave lectures without notes, and I said, what I do is stand-up art history. So maybe that's what you're going to get today. But anyway, but when you think of the juxtaposition, the particular juxtaposition here, and if you think of the history and reception of Warhol's work, when Warhol came on the scene, along with the other pop artists, but when particularly Warhol came on the scene, he was viewed as the antithesis of everything that people held dear in art. Full, warm, human feeling, respect for the deep, hidden, turbulent insides of the human personage, and so on and so forth. He was about surfaces, he was about coolness, he was about celebrity, he was about all these things that were so-called superficial, right? That model was applied to lots of other artists. Jasper Johns was somebody else who was thought of as being the antithesis of abstract expressionism. And now, with a good distance from the 60s, those false dichotomies sort of have blown away. But it doesn't really answer the question of how do you regard this combination of people? How do you regard the king of cool with the, if you will, the king of hot? How do you deal with a terribly, terribly inward artist of his period and another artist who is concerned very much with the facades that people invent for themselves, the ones he invented for himself? But then, of course, Warhol, as we now know, and as many people knew all along, it was a much more complicated, layered person, that in his surface were embedded what used to be thought of as being things below the surface and beyond that, so that there are lots of ways of thinking about Warhol that are suggested by this encounter. So what I really want to do after this little brief attempt on my part to sort of open up some possibilities is to really ask two artists who themselves have relationships to the world that Warhol made, to the world itself, to questions of interiority and personae, or the forms that we make of ourselves for public consumption. All of this, to talk about this work, what it means to them, and I mean by this work both the Munch precedent and the Warhol follow-up.
The thing that jumped out at me in the exhibition was the term singular multiple, which is what both the Warhols ended up being, because they weren't editioned, and the Munchs were, because of the nature of the way he made prints and the fact that he was his own printmaker, and I'd love to know more about whether or not he had a litho press, you know, it's like all that kind of detail, which I don't know, but somehow he was doing pretty extreme things to his prints. I found it really interesting and sort of surprising, because I wasn't really quite sure. When Rob says to show up, I just show up. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I was like, I heard it was a talk on Munch, and then I found out it was Warhol and Munch, and I was like, uh-oh, I'm a little out of my depth here. And then my husband said, don't research it. Just show up, look at the show, and, you know, do a stand-up. Like,
good advice.
Yeah. So I did that. And the thing that sort of surprised me is that in the past year, I've been very involved in printmaking ever since I was an undergraduate at Tyler School of Art, where Rob was also a faculty member. Just because I liked the way prints looked. I would look at artists like Munch or Degas or whoever, and I would, without any hierarchy, I would look at how it was made. And over and over and over again, what I would see was the word lithograph or monoprint or serigraphy or etching or dry point. And I would see these words and I'd say, well, that must be worth pursuing, you know, because if it said pen and ink, I would try that. So I would often be guided as a young artist to explore something that I liked, you know, I liked what I was seeing, and then I would see the medium and I would explore it. So I found that with printmaking, I was like, you know, signed up for litho. And so when you're a student, you learn how to actually do it all, like as if you're a printer. So then later in life, now after I'm out of school, it's kind of, you know, you can't make a lithograph without a master lithographer, and if you're a young artist, nobody wants to make prints with you because it's expensive. So at a certain point, I finally tried to find somebody to make prints with, and everywhere I went, they said, you can't work on a stone because stones break. And I was like, I know stones break, but if you're any good, you'll figure out. Anyway, long story short, I ended up working with Bill Goldston at Universal Limited Art Editions, where when Rauschenberg was making a print and the stone broke, it's one of the most famous prints in America. They were running it through the press, the stone broke, and Bob said, keep printing. And Bill Goldston was the master printer at the time, and he was like, I love it. And so to this day, Bill is still saying to artists who want to do sort of stuff that's a little unusual, I love it, because when I found, somebody just introduced me to Bill, you know, it was like about almost 10 years ago now. But a couple years ago, I said to Bill, in other words, he did let me work on stone, and he wasn't worried about them breaking, and we had been making prints. But I got over the course of the past 10 years a little bit disillusioned with the idea of making one of 40 and that whole boring thing where you sign it, you spend the afternoon and sign it. And I know it just felt very, I was like, eh. And then nobody really seems excited about the prints because they're prints, you know, and the world is very hierarchical. You know, it's like you give them to benefits and nobody bids on them because they're only a print. And then I love the prints, so I feel sort of sorry for them. And recently, a whole bunch of my prints got washed out to sea during the flood, and I felt worse about that than some of the original work, and I was like, I don't really understand that about myself, but it felt like as I loved them as objects. At any rate, I said to Bill, what would happen if we stopped editioning them? I want to make one. I mean, it's ridiculous because it's sort of expensive to have somebody make a print with you, and their whole livelihood is based on one of 40. So in other words, the real multiple is what they're in business for. And Bill said, I love it. And I went ahead and he said, what do you think? And I started to make what in essence is a singular multiple. And I never knew that word until today. So just to answer your question in a completely asinine roundabout way, that's sort of how I now realize I fit in here, is that I never knew the word singular, or the term singular multiple, but what I've been doing with Bill is doing a drawing on a very fragile plate that once you run it through the press, because of the material, it's finished. It's a very soft metal, and you can't make copies of it.
So it's a monoprint, basically.
In essence, and then I've been doing a lot of and then I can get back to it if it's interesting to you, but at any rate, in the end, these things I ended up then doing a lot of drawing on and pastel on, and it's been very interesting for us, but I didn't know that that's what it was called.
I did have to do a little homework before coming here because, in fact, what I'm saying links to the fact that I've always been very diffident of art history per se, just because I just don't think that linear, not diffident, but I feel a bit impatient with reading art history because I just don't think, always feel that linear thinking does not catch the actual way things work. So it's like going around a thing without really catching it. And yes, in this case, doing my little homework, because I've always felt an affinity, or I always liked Munch work, but I never really knew the story. I went a little bit through the story, and I think there are points in common with Warhol. For example, I noticed that he was very keen on covering his tracks. He understood very well that it's not enough to do some great works. You also have to invent a narrative so that the audience, which not necessarily can really partake of the greatness of the work and actually may be scared away by the greatness of the work, needs a little handle of a simple story to feel sympathetic. I think he did that a lot, and Warhol did that, I feel. And then, but would be more of a question for you, maybe who knows more, you know more than me. Isn't there like a satirical side to Munch and to Warhol? That would be something that they have in common. What do you think of that?
Well, the answer is yes. And Karen maybe can jump in at this point, but there's a famous view of the main drag in Oslo with the bourgeoisie sort of aligned along the street, which is, by the way, very much the same now, although the clothing has changed. And it's a kind of stand-up of upper middle class life in Oslo, when Oslo was a capital relative to the rest of the country, which was mostly rural. But maybe Karen can say more about this. But I sense that there is definitely satire involved, and that what happened in the reception of Warhol is that he was turned into a kind of one-note artist, when in fact he was not a one-note artist. He had multiple registers. One just parenthetical thing is, thanks actually to Ed Gallagher, I have the catalogue raisonné of Munch's work. And something I knew already but did not know the extent of was how many times he did certain images over and over and over and over. And he did it in a way that modern artists now conventionally almost rework and revise and refine imagery. And the idea of expressionism being the sudden eruption of unmediated feeling, one time only, authentic, sort of, I don't know, just again, eruption of feeling, is nonsense. That actually he, and you can see it upstairs. He took the scream, and he took the self-portrait, and he took the woman sort of temptress and did them many different ways for different nuances, and that's kind of wonderful.
Well, we know that is only if we think of the way de Kooning painted his pictures when he would draw on the newspaper and transfer. That alone is a huge mediating tool. There is nothing immediate about that, right? Lisa, a word on satire. Yes. Is there satire in your work?
I actually just wanted to ask you to make an example of what you were saying about what you saw in the work, like the things that they, there was your comment. I wanted you to elaborate on your comment.
On the common things between the two?
Like,
well, more, yeah, I was thinking really about the certain attitudes. I always felt that Andy Warhol was very good at covering his tracks, creating this persona which was very audience friendly.
Can you elaborate on like how you see? You were saying creating a story, that and you call that covering tracks, which I think is very.
Well, covering tracks in Munch's case would be the story of illness, disease, insanity, etc., which obviously we both know cannot be the state of mind of an artist. An artist is fundamentally an ecstatically happy person, otherwise he can't work. So the life before the ecstatic moment can be troublesome, but that's not what you can be when you work. You wouldn't be able to work.
Some red meat.
You can still be grumpy.
Grumpy?
Yes.
I don't know. I never think of. I thought where you were going to go was, that they're rational people, or that they have to be both extremely right-brained and left-brained. I mean, it's just in general something that annoys me about. I won't even say the times that we live in, or disappoints me both in myself, but I work really hard on sort of not falling into this trap, and is the desire to see things rather flatly and one-dimensionally, like that. I mean, and these two artists are perfect examples. Or I was talking about Vincent van Gogh with like the obsession about his madness, and it's like I remember looking at his work and thinking, oh. I mean, this is a hard-working, rational guy. Maybe he had a couple of moments.
You could say he's a classicist when you look at his work.
Maybe
very,
had a couple of, really bad days, much worse than most people's, and made some bad decisions. But, like, that's the weird thing. It's so boring to flatten everything. It's almost like it's important in order to be famous. You have to be able to flatten it, to fit it through a Xerox machine and pass it out, like throw it off. That's what happens. That's the pity. That's what you lose in this kind of celebrity is that type of thing where the public goes, oh, isn't he the guy who, aren't you the one that does the big boobs? And I'm like, yeah, well, guilty, but if that, it's like, that's the Xerox version, and it's like, I could avoid that by, not doing that, but it's just the I can't pay attention to it, and obviously they, I think I don't know enough about what Munch's what the reception that he was aware of in terms of his work, but it's like neither one of these guys had to live in a time of the internet, Imagine Munch Googling himself.
What do you think the status of Hysteria is now relative to when the Scream was made? I mean, the Scream was a very, very radical image for its time, and it, in a sense, gave pictorial voice to an extreme degree of anxiety and hysteria. But also hysteria as an idea was something different than it is now. What I see nowadays more than Munch's hysteria is inflatable toys making fun of Munch's hysteria. And I wonder if that has something to do with a change in cultural sensibility or historical moment or whatever.
But
inflatable
the line
screen.
between funny and scary is a very thin line. I think some primitive sculptures are funny. They were meant to be funny. They're not necessarily scary. It's, you know, the laughter is the first protection from fear. I mean, they're very close.
Do you think that the scream actually is, in effect, a funny picture in some way?
Yes.
I had the same impression. I actually thought that the Warhols made me feel more upset on a certain level, and I wasn't sure why. I didn't have enough time to process it. And it just, you know, what it must have been like to work with those images, and you know, I don't know, there's something kind of happened there that did surprise me, and I do think that, especially, I mean, how could he not know that was sort of fun? It's so extreme at a certain point, you know. But extreme emotion is something in art that I'm actually kind of interested in, and I'm allowing myself to be more and more interested in. And it's not a terribly cool thing. It's, you know, it's the opposite of cool. You know, it's like that. You know, that's an image that's iconic, and obviously Warhol was mostly interested in iconic images even outside of other people's work, you know, whether it be an electric chair or a widow of a certain sort. You know, it's like that these were all extremely, he was just picking iconic images.
One of my favorite, if you will, zones of art is the grotesque, and both of you were in an exhibition that I did in Santa Fe about the grotesque. And are we not speaking in effect of the grotesque, which is almost by definition a kind of art in which conflicting impulses meet in the same image, and the viewer is left to deal with both as they will, and where in a sense it's the will of the artist to make sure that they're really locked in. Is this a grotesque? Is the scream a grotesque? Classic grotesque? Just so you don't forget, that's what it looks like. Or, for example, in the one where it's the Madonna, where the original version, she's in a kind of orgasmic ecstasy. In the Warhol version, her eyes are popping out.
Yeah, I think that was why that was more scary, like more frightening. Yeah. I thought like Warhol kind of like made it a little more like, whoa, you know, like he kind of pushed it a little further in that poppy way, which sort of took, you know, it was almost like a recipe where you take something out of it and then push something else, that it just upped the ante of emotion in that image. I never really understand the whole grotesque thing. I really don't. I always struggle to completely wrap my mind around it but again, it's because it's so categorical, and I don't really think that way. I know it's important to do it, but I think as an artist, it becomes important not to do it. Like,
well, I don't think any artist sets to work to achieve either the grotesque or the sublime, being the two the two faces of the same coin. But I think maybe any artist who gets in touch with the strong, you know, iconic moment encounter either one, because he encountered a situation where conflicting emotions sort of collide and melt together. So maybe is that a possible view of this?
You worked with Warhol on one collaboration. I knew him quite well. I mean, what do you think his sort of the frame of mind in which he might have been working on these images would have been?
Well, he was, my reason to feel an affinity or a passion for Warhol, which I always felt, was his inclusiveness. I felt that I'm on the side of everything that is inclusive, that contemplate the fact that there is more than one truth, more than one solution, more than one lineage, more than one tradition, etc. And I felt that he had that kind of mind and that kind of capacity to make his all sorts of conflicting, fragmented realities that are commonly perceived as conflicting and fragmented, but they're not. They're all part of the same song. I mean, they're all notes in the same song. And so You know, I think he saw also the tenderness of this thing, you know, the weakness of it. Nothing is really that strong and that hard, you know. Only the story makes it hard, but the real things are very tender and soft. And yeah, you know, he saw this just the same way he saw the bodies of those people in the car crashes, like there's something super gentle and vulnerable. And he liked to touch them and he liked to look at it because he was the biggest voyeur. So he was just watching. Being the voyeur that he was, his biggest fear was to die in his sleep. And that's how he died. He died in his sleep, which was he always said that this was the last thing he wanted. He wanted to be present at that moment because he wanted to watch everything, including his own death.
In terms of, again, the sort of the persistence of these stereotypes, I mean, how available is Munch now, do you think, to people? He's become a kind of legendary artist, but is he within reach for people working now, for you?
You mean people or artists?
Artists.
Well, honestly, I never think about him. I was happy to think about him. I was enchanted with everything I looked at again. But no, it's not very present in my universe. There is an ambiguity to him that bothers me. I don't know what it is.
What's the ambiguity?
Well, I mean, it's also what is attractive, because of course the minute you start dealing past the, I guess, the 18th century, the moment you start to deal with the life of the soul or the inner life, you're borderline kitsch. You know, you can think of William Blake as already semi-kitsch. I say this is a paradox, but the problem is there. You can think of Joseph Beuys as on the edge, you know, but with him I can't really place him. I'm a fanatic, so I think there are some artists who actually know what the subject matter of the problem is, and others who just entertain. And with him, I just can't understand which side is he on. So, I don't know.
I looked at him a lot, over the years, but along with people like Beckman or Gaston, just this stream of people who, or even like I didn't distinguish between painters and filmmakers like Fassbinder, Tarkovsky. I just liked it hard and painful, and I didn't like the more seemingly simplistic, happy stories that were told and finished. I always felt quite alone when I'd look at art like the other. And if I saw things like this, or as I say, these films, I felt I would walk out of the Tarkovsky Festival feeling happy. And then I had to note, what the hell is that? I remember at MoMA they did they would always do these festivals, and people were just leaving, like during these things, about the boredom, or just, like, I can't believe this. I remember going to see Sallow, 100 Days of Sodom, and I knew what the subject matter was, but I was afraid to see it because, it's, one of the most difficult films I had heard, and I sat there, and like 5 minutes into it, every seat, pop, 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 pop. And, it was like kind of fascinating, but I think that there are artists that I feel generally a friendship towards, and he would be one of them, who just make me. I'd say, like, not me as necessarily even an artist, but as a person, less alone. Because I don't. I've never walked down the street, and felt that way particularly. Maybe as a kid or something. Kids, have that kind of intensity, but. It's, I think it's important work that way. It's an important guide. I also love the sort of idea that, like, looking at pictures is like a seance. The dead is talking to you and you're talking to the dead. And if you're just there to listen, they're telling you stuff. And you look at these pictures upstairs and it's just like, why are there sperm around the edges. Like, he actually put sperm around the edges of this Madonna. Like, why isn't that funny? That's, you know, didn't anybody else think that was funny? Like, it kind of, and then a little baby skeleton, which is like, you know, goofy in a way. That, you know, and I was looking at it, I'm not the kind of viewer that stands there and says, like, what is that, the dead baby Jesus? You know, I don't feel like I need to shake loose the meaning of what that dead baby skeleton was.
Well, I think just when there is so much form, and there is so much form here, he's such a great artist, he's a fantastic painter. You get away with these stories that wouldn't work if you told them, you know? Every child is Jesus. Yes, sure. You can't say that, but it's true. But you can show it in a picture like that, and the meaning gets lost into the form, and it just goes through.
I also love that one moment where Warhol took that woman's brooch and moved it up to her face.
Yes.
That was a really great moment in the Warhol. He sort of, you know, he just started messing around with this in a way that was kind of interesting and played with it. They're quite shocking in a way and fun. I mean, I really thought it was an interesting pairing. And in a sense, Warhol would not be somebody that I would have necessarily put on my list of someone that made me feel, you know, connected to, you know, this kind of stream of sadness and depth of feeling. But I guess in a sense, you know, as I think about Warhol, he is. And then, you know,
he's such a great colorist. Just the color of Warhol is feeling. I mean, it's so strong.
Fantastic.
It's so fantastic. I mean, upstairs, it's fantastic what he does. There is one where the figure is blown orange. It becomes almost invisible. It's so great.
Maybe somebody has something
Well,
good to say.
I was just going to throw in one more thing, and then we can open it the house. But there's also another figure in the room, almost, who had a dialogue with Munch, and that's Jasper Johns. And Jasper did a series of paintings, Between the Clock and the Bed, which take a late Munch painting and turn it into an abstraction. And that's one case of an artist who's developed a different kind of dialogue with this past figure. But I like your idea of sort of having a posthumous conversation or whatever it is. And what do you make of Johns' paintings based on Munch? How do you feel about those?
Well, claustrophobia. I mean, isn't Jasper Johns the idea of building a wall and filling it up with everything that there is and just suck in the entire world within those four walls and have the complete control of that grid? And in Munch there is a lot of closed rooms where all the passions, life and death, it doesn't happen outdoor, it happens always within those four walls. So I think it makes a lot of sense that he would look at something like that with sympathetically.
Johns puts himself in the picture and then takes everyone out of the picture, which is, you know, I think where you're saying, it's like Johns has that effect where it sort of becomes hermetic, and like nobody kind of is left in there. I'm a fan, and in particular a fan.
Me too, I'm a fan. I'm a huge fan
of the singular multiples. I mean, that's the thing, is that he actually is another artist who works with printmaking in such an intense and vigorous way, and also did things and drew on them and did, you know, many things. So I think he's the right person to.
I'm also fond of all the artists you mentioned, Beckman and Gaston. In a way, I find both Beckman and Gaston warmer. You know, there is something warmer, and which less so in
So,
Munch.
Can I totally change the subject and say something about you?
I was hoping you would.
So when I just got out of graduate school, like '86, at Yale, Rob wasn't there yet, and I could not get a real teaching job to save my life. I could not get a gallery. I mean, forget about that. And young artists were not considered a good thing then. It wasn't until I was like 50 that maybe being a young artist was a good thing. I was like, I missed that one. And a lot of things, as the way they are now, weren't going on then. So I had to figure out a way to support myself. And one of the things I came up with was, if I could teach watercolor to old ladies, you know the story a little bit. I say old ladies because I was like 20-something. I probably was teaching people my age. So it was like I came up with this shtick after seeing an amazing show of Francesco's at Speroni Westwater. I think it was called The Black Book. And I would have done anything. I never thought of stealing art quite as much as I did that show. And there were these cases all around the galleries with these beautiful torn sheets. They were 1/16 of a watercolor sheet. I even learned, you know, right? 1/16 of a watercolor sheet. And I would put up flyers all over the city that'd say, you know, watercolor classes in Central Park, Yale graduate, so pathetic. And like tearaway, you know? And people would call, and then word got around. I was very big with the NYU shrinks, like they all passed me around. Oh. Anyway, because they said I was very analytical. And anyway, so anybody who paid and wasn't too annoying, I was willing to take on. So we would meet in Central Park or wherever, and we would do watercolors. And inevitably, I would show them great watercolors, and I showed them Francesco's watercolors. And one of my favorite things was these, some of them were men, but many of them were ladies, and they were just amazed at all the many ways you painted vaginas in watercolor. This particular series of works, because what was amazing, it was just a female figure, but it was very serialized, and there was like an eye, of course, like, you know, the eye was always a little different, but the more you know about watercolor, which I know a lot about watercolor, and because I had to teach it, and when you teach people like that, you can't get away with not really knowing it. Like they're onto you and you don't really know it, so I had to really teach myself. And the incredible stuff that you did, the playfulness of what you did, what he would paint with, I only know this because I know the medium so well. He would paint certain, like, let's say he wanted to paint the vagina in like a swirl. He would paint it with clear water and drop the watercolor in and let the color blend and then dry. It was so fun. And I remember taking these ladies and they were like so sophisticated. Like they just loved, and they were such fans. And one day, you don't know this part, you were walking through Soho, we were there, and one of them said, "Isn't that Francesco Clemente? Let's follow him." I said, I don't think I should do that. But anyway, so at one point I actually I had bought your catalog, and I tore one of the pages out and framed it and hung it in my living room for years. I loved it so much. So anyway, I'm an incredible big fan of the work that way.
Now I'm blushing.
I mentioned Jasper Johns as an artist for whom Munch was very important. One other artist who is no longer with us is Elizabeth Murray. And Elizabeth Murray made a number, I mean, I would say 10, 15 paintings in which the face, is this red alert? Okay, that she made 10 or 15 paintings, drawings, whatever it is, where the head from the screen becomes the centerpiece, but where it's put in an entirely different context, where the mood of its presence is entirely different, and so on and so forth. So the usefulness of any detail or aspect or impression or suggestion that an image makes is totally unpredictable. And why a hard-bitten Chicago painter should suddenly discover that in Munch there was something useful is inexplicable, but there's no question that she found it useful. So I'm assuming that somebody else from someplace else will make a similar kind of discovery, and we will be surprised.